Welcome to the Be the Change podcast with your host, Ralph Harper. On this podcast, he shares his vision for the future of the United States. Think of this podcast as somewhat of a roadmap to times in the future on a continuum from a dark past to the 2060s. Yep, that's right. He's a forward thinker whose purpose is to dictate positive outcomes for our children and our country versus leaving it all to chance. Ralph will cover parenting, fatherhood, accountability, and what it takes to win in this great nation. It's not just Ralph. He will have difficult conversations with other thought leaders of different backgrounds and political affiliations. It's time to get started. Here's your host, Ralph Harper.
Hello and welcome to Be the Change podcast. Today I'd like to cover the Trump era. I've decided to spell era, E-R-R-O-R. President Trump has been in office now for just over 2 years. For me, it feels like he's been in office for 10 to 20 years. These are, in my opinion, some trying times, not just for me, but it seems for a lot of people in our country. It begs the question to me, what our forefathers might have anticipated would happen when they originally founded the United States of America. I can't imagine they anticipated a civil war where over 600,000 citizens died fighting for and against slavery. I can't imagine they anticipated that slavery would actually end just over 100 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. I can't imagine they anticipated there would be 2 world wars. I can't imagine they would have anticipated the fact that the United States would be made up of 50 states. I can't imagine they anticipated that former slaves would become full citizens of the United States of America. I can't imagine our forefathers thought about nuclear weapons, nuclear bombs, and the potential of a nuclear war. I can't imagine that our forefathers thought about a notion of superpowers or the fact that the United States of America would become one of them. Then I also can't imagine that our forefathers anticipated the United States would actually become the most powerful country in the entire world. I can say to you unequivocally and with keen confidence that our forefathers never anticipated a black American man could become president of the United States of America. But it seems odd to me that the one thing that they did anticipate is the fact that someone like Donald Trump could become president of the United States. And so they decided, and they made very conscious choices to include in our Constitution checks and balances. They spread the accountability of our government across 3 distinct functions: the executive office, the Senate, and the House of Representatives. They did that with the expectation that if for some reason someone was able to land in that role as president of the United States, someone who might be crazy, and please don't take it wrong, I am not being accusatory. I am suggesting that it is a possibility that someone who is unstable could land in that office. And when something like that was to happen, they included checks and balances so that the Senate and the entire Congress could take action to have that person removed from that office. They were very deliberate in this regard because it's so important to have that level of check and balance so that a single person would not have the complete power to cause significant harm to the grand population of our entire country. it was one of the most insightful things that our forefathers was able to etch into the Constitution of the United States of America. I guess these checks and balances were important because, quite honestly, it really doesn't take much to become president of the United States of America. And what I mean is that not much is actually required. Almost any legitimate citizen of our country can become president of the United States of America. I know that you have to at least be 35 years old and you have to be a natural born citizen of the United States. Now, while some might argue and pretend that you have to be a lawyer or you have to be whatever, or you have to have served in Congress or you have to have run for office or something like that, that is absolutely not the case. Those are the defined requirements for becoming president of the United States. The other requirement is that you have to run and be elected, but anyone in our country can run for president of the United States. And so that's why it's important, because anybody can run. There's that chance the wrong person may be successful in that process. There is a profound difference related to someone being qualified to be president of the United States versus someone being fit to be president of the United States. But with all that said, I'd like to introduce another brilliant mind into this conversation. I met this young man when he was 3 years old, and I've known him for all those years since. He's 29 now, and he's one of the smartest people I know. He's worked with PepsiCo for a while as an analyst. He left there and played a role at another company called Reward Styles, which is a blogging company. They focus on models and selling certain products and that kind of thing. But over the last several years, he's been an executive partner in a company called Aerostrat. And this young man is the smartest man I know, like I've said before, and it just happens that he is my son. So I want to introduce you to Cody Morris. He's going to come in and join the conversation. Cody, what's up?
Hey, Ralph. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for being a part of this. We're going to make this fun. We're going to try to be objective about this conversation related to Trump, but I know you and I share some common views, but let's challenge each other to think outside the box a little bit.
Yeah, that sounds great. I think we both have a lot to say on the subject, and I think we also might have slightly different perspectives as well, so I think it'll be a good discussion.
Cool. Okay, let's go to work. What I'd like to do is cover like 3 topics. I'd like to cover first the Trump election, and then second, I'd like to just have a conversation about the Trump presidency just in general terms. But then also I'd like to just talk about the question of whether or not our president could be compromised. So let's start it out. I have the first question, and you and I can go back and forth and ask each other some of these questions. So the first question I have is, was there any collusion or not in terms of the whole process of Trump's election? Do you think there was any collusion?
Yeah, I think that when you look at how Trump ran his campaign and really everything about Trump, including his businesses, there's a lot of things that aren't standard. They stand out as being new or different, things that we haven't seen in other presidential candidates. And, today is actually the perfect day to be discussing this, given that earlier this morning, I believe the feds subpoenaed Trump's inaugural committee and campaign. So there's clearly things going on that are non-standard. And when you look at it objectively, I think it's hard to argue that there wasn't some level of cooperation between Trump and outside, potentially foreign agents. So yes, I think there was, and I think that the facts show that. And as Mueller and the rest of the investigators in the country kind of hone in on the details, I think more of that will come out and become clear.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. It's hard, and I respect the fact that certain Republicans come in and say, well, we have to wait on all the facts to come out. But some of this evidence is so compelling.
Right.
It seems to me to be intuitive that there are certain things going on.
Yeah, you know what they say. If it looks like a duck, if it quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. I think that's the first time I've ever said that out loud. But it seems fitting. If you just look at it objectively and set all the emotion aside, it's clear that this is not normal. I think you can start the discussion from there.
Absolutely.
Right?
I totally agree with you on that. So, when you think about this, think about all the people around Donald Trump.
Right. Cohen, Manafort.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's more.
There's a
laundry list.
A long laundry list of people who've either been convicted, otherwise they have pled guilty to something related to all of this stuff. So it's hard to just assume that Donald Trump, our president of the United States, was neutral in all of this.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine. You can kind of imagine that the response from Trump and from the executive office will be that these things happened without him directly knowing about it or without him directing it to occur. But on the other hand, he seems to purport himself as this CEO, executive level leader, and it's hard to imagine that he wouldn't know these things. Right. Like, he should know these things if he is who he says he is, and he's running the country as a business, and he ran his campaign as a business. Then you need to know what the people under you are doing.
Well, you would think.
Right. You would hope.
But he seems to deny and deny and deny. Mm-hmm. Especially, it's not just random people within a circle. There are people who are members of his family.
Right.
Who appear to have been involved in a lot of this stuff as well.
Yes. And what we've seen from this president, which is also abnormal, is that he lies more than any other president than we've ever experienced that we know of. And no one in the media really wants to call it a lie.
Right.
But that's what it is. And I mean, it's blatant untruths. And that's a term that the media likes to use, untruth. No, but we need to call it what it is. No, it's a lie.
I have to agree with you. It's a lie.
Yeah.
And it's pretty obvious. And it's weird how, quite honestly, he has the audacity to say certain things, and then he's also willing to deny he said them on the back end, which to me is uncanny and a little bit weird.
Yeah, it's weird, and I think that it kind of signals a dramatic shift and change in the world that we live in, because now we live in a world where when you say something, it travels the world instantly.
Yes.
And you can get a lie out there at the speed of a tweet.
Yes.
But it
which
takes,
he does
but
all the time.
Which he does. But it takes days or weeks for the truth to reach people at the same speed as the lies. And once it hits, people don't even believe it. Yeah. So I don't know where that leaves us.
It's weird how it seems that the lie prevails, mm-hmm. and the actual truth doesn't get as much play.
Yes.
It's interesting to see that.
I think the circumstance that allows that is intentional. I think the distrust in the truth was intentionally created, right?
Yes.
Through disinformation campaigns.
Oh, absolutely.
And the distrust that people have in the media, aka fake news, yep. as Trump likes to call it, these are all things that were architected intentionally so that untruths could be spread, Absolutely. So that lies could be spread.
I'll say this last thing really quickly
Sure.
so we can move to the next topic, but I will say that over 30 years ago when I was in college, our professor would always talk about Russia and this notion of disinformation. We were required to read the Wall Street Journal, and he would give us pop quizzes and that kind of thing. But
right.
It's interesting that Russia has always been the master of this notion of disinformation, and here we are with Trump seemingly mastering it as well.
Absolutely. It's not a new tactic.
Yeah.
It's something that's been used throughout all of humanity.
Absolutely.
And it works well, and we can see that in what's happening today.
Quick question. Did Donald Trump steal the election?
I like this question because I think it can be approached in a few different ways. I think that when you look at what happened with Cambridge Analytica and the use of data from Facebook to target specific people with disinformation or memes or things that shifted the mindset against Hillary. You can definitely say that he did things that were out of the box and unethical to get the election won. But I think that there was also failure on the Democratic side with the DNC, and they really handed it to him as well.
Yeah, I have to agree with that. I think Hillary Clinton seemed to me, just my opinion, seemed to be a little bit too complacent and just anticipating there was no way that someone like Donald Trump could win. And meanwhile, she got it handed to her, and it's unfortunate, but I think that's the reality of what happened.
You're right. The reality is that she was complacent. Everyone assumed she would win. They ignored a lot of battleground states that they should have been paying attention to.
Yes.
And then even looking back in the last 10 years, the Democrats have not done as good of a job as the Republicans have in terms of strategically redrawing districts in ways that would help them using technology. So I think that there have been multiple missteps on the Democrats' side that led to this as well.
Absolutely. I was in a social gathering with Eric Holder, and he's touting this notion. Well, it's not a notion, actually. He has a project where he's working towards redistricting, not necessarily to make things more balanced towards Democrats, but to make things just more equal, the way they should be and the way they have been in the past.
Absolutely.
Good.
So in that same line of thought, do you think that Donald Trump is a legitimate U.S. president?
I think he is. And I think he is because he won the election. And our process is pretty simple. The person who gets that number of votes required, those electoral votes required to be president, is the person that becomes president of the United States. He ran an election, and he won. That makes him legitimate as a president. How he did it might be a question.
You're right. I mean, if you get the votes and you're declared president, that makes you a legitimate president. But I am curious to know if Mueller's report comes back and says there was collusion, if all of these accusations prove to be true, where do you think that leaves us as a country? That
leaves us with a big question about whether or not he's a legitimate president.
Right. And what to do about it.
Exactly, and what should be done about it. The thing that really concerns me is that, it's just weird to see, and this may be sidetracking a little bit, but it's just weird to see men who were once so powerful, like Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan. These grown men seem to be so vulnerable these days and unwilling to do what probably should be done. And I'm just concerned that even if it comes back that it is very definitive Donald Trump was involved in collusion or whatever the case may be, it's a question of whether or not they will be willing to do something. And that is the piece that really concerns me.
I think that's a fair concern. I like the direction that you brought this conversation, because I really think that your point is one that needs to be addressed before we can begin to have any sense of normalcy in our political process.
Yes.
And if you look at Paul Ryan, Mitch McConnell, any government person who seems to be acting against the best interests of the people, it's really obvious why that is. And that's because of unlimited money flowing into politics.
Absolutely.
And the fact in reality that if Paul Ryan, if Mitch McConnell, if these leaders go against what their corporate donors want, their corporate donors will put their entire wallets into the person challenging them, and their careers will be ended.
Yes.
So to really solve that and to expect our government to act in our best interests, unlimited corporate money has to be removed from politics, and that's just the bottom line.
Yeah, I agree with that. So do you believe that what we're seeing in terms of the gross ignorance, right? They seem to be completely ignoring some of the things that are happening in the President Trump presidency. Do you think that is because of their personal interest in terms of what they might do after they leave Congress and become great speakers and just kind of placating to corporate funding and dollars?
Absolutely. Since Citizens United, the Supreme Court ruled that money is free speech.
Absolutely.
And what these people are doing is just reacting to the speech, quote unquote, of their constituents, which is in the form of millions of dollars that go flowing to them. So I think to take a more positive outlook on this, you do have some Congress people who are bucking the trend, who don't take PAC money, super PAC money, don't take big corporate money, and are pushing their whole campaigns just on individual contributions. If you look at the most famous person, it would probably be Bernie Sanders, who ran his presidency without any super PAC money,
Right.
and only got money from everyday people in chunks of $20, $25, $30,
Yes.
raise enough money to compete. And then if you look at the next generation, you have AOC, you have Beto, you have more and more people coming out and saying, I'm not going to take corporate money. I'm not going to take super PAC money where you don't know where it's coming from.
Absolutely.
And then this way, people who vote for me will have faith that I actually have their interests in mind, rather than the millionaires who are giving me money behind the scenes.
Within your realm,
Sure.
in terms of you being a millennial, what do younger people think about Beto?
I think that anyone in my circle who I've spoken to about Beto, they definitely like him more than any other candidate that has come out of Texas in recent memory. I think they see him as an example of how someone should act while they're running. He seems more like an everyday person, but I think there's also some frustration from people who wanted to see him win that
Yes.
election,
Yep.
in the sense that he had certain political beliefs that he was unwilling to set aside, which made his ability to win Texas much more challenging.
Yes. Yep.
The number one example is gun control, right?
Yes.
So to be running for election in Texas and be staunchly opposed to guns just leaves you in a situation where it's hard to win.
Absolutely. It's interesting though, but Texas is a big gun state,
Right.
and still Beto was very competitive.
And he was close.
Very
I
competitive.
think a lot of people, me included, myself included, think that if he would have been a little softer on that issue,
Right.
he would have had a real chance of winning,
Yeah.
which is a shame.
Do you think he's? Do you think there's a legitimate chance he might first run for president, and do you think he has a legitimate chance of winning?
I'm happy to see anyone run for president that doesn't take super PAC money.
Right.
And I'd rather vote for anyone who doesn't take super PAC money
Absolutely.
over anyone who does, because I have no reason to believe that someone who takes super PAC money will ever act in my best interest.
Okay. Speaking of funding,
Sure.
and we'll move on to the next topic, but I have to ask you this. There have been rumblings of folks who say that Beto, who has about $80 million stashed away,
Right.
that he should be sharing some of that money with other Democrats. What do you think?
I don't think that's the case.
Neither do I.
Yeah.
Neither do
I don't know why he would do that. I mean, I'll be totally honest. I'm not very educated on this subject. I wasn't even aware of the $80 million war chest that he had.
Right.
But the reality is that he got that from individual contributions sent
Right.
directly to him.
Exactly.
And I don't know how I would feel if I had donated to him and then I saw that money going to another
Exactly.
candidate who may or may not represent what I believe in.
Absolutely, and he busted his butt. He
he worked
every
hard.
single county in the state of Texas, and Texas is the second largest state in the union, next to Alaska. And he bounced around to every single county in this country to raise that money. And I tell you, the audacity of someone to suggest you should give that money to some of us because we need it for some of these other campaigns. That seems nonsensical to me.
It seems absurd, and I think Texas is a good microcosm of the reality of the country because it is so large and it is so diverse. You really have all types of people from all types of backgrounds with all types of political views in this state. People underestimate that. People have outside of Texas, have a very straight view of what they think Texas is, which is not accurate.
Yes.
And I think when you see someone like Beto come out reach across the aisle and talk about the issues that actually matter sincerely, it resonates with people. And that's why you have a Democrat that could come that close to winning.
Absolutely. In Texas.
In Texas. So while we're on the subject of money, let's talk about the economy a little bit. Do you think President Trump deserves full credit for the fact that the economy is doing quite well right now?
I think he deserves some credit, but I think Obama deserves some of the credit as well. I think Donald Trump's decisions, especially on the tax reform, that has broad-reaching positive views from our citizenry. But people aren't necessarily looking at the bigger picture in terms of debt and the fact that our country is not generating enough revenue from taxes to cover some of the things that we should be covering. So it's a question. So it's one of those things where there's no way. I mean, I'd be remiss just to come in to say definitively no. But I just think there is a question about how he's doing certain things.
Right. Yeah. I would agree with that. I think this is always a trap that Democrats and Republicans fall into, where you try to decide who gets the credit for the economy, right?
Yes.
So if you look at the facts, if you take a step back, the reality is Obama pulled us out of a recession, unlike anything that we had seen in recent history. And since that time, the economy has been on an upswing and a bull market for the longest bull market that has occurred in my lifetime.
Yes.
And I think there's a lot of factors at play there. A lot of people will point at the Federal Reserve, they'll point at other actors who have helped keep the economy going, or point out the fact that there's a disconnect between what's going on in the stock market and Wall Street and what's going on in everyday America.
Yes.
But I really think it's going to take a few years and the solidification of these trade deals, which have been torn up and put back together, like NAFTA, for example, which was put back together in almost the same way with a different name.
Pretty much, yeah.
I think it'll take a few years to really see how it pans out.
Yeah, and I think about Obama. I don't want to dwell on Obama, but obviously I'm a little bit biased towards President Obama. But I think about those major automotive companies who needed bailouts during the recession you talked about. And a lot of Republicans balked, and they were like, well, why is he loaning money to these major corporations? But those corporations took that money, they came back, they paid it back with pretty significant interest back to the government. And as a result, those companies are thriving today.
Absolutely. If you look at the automaker bailout, it was unequivocally a success.
Yes.
I'm not sure the same can be said about Wall Street's bailout, given that there has been little to no regulation that has teeth put in place to protect us from the same kind of situation happening again.
Yes.
So that's kind of, it's a more unique situation when it comes to that. But I think he deserves part of the credit. But you bring up a good point, which is that when Obama was president, the number one rallying cry of the Tea Party movement and the right wing was that the deficit was too high and we needed to stop all spending and the government was spending way too much money and you had to starve the beast, so to speak.
Yes.
But what's interesting is I hear none of that anymore as our deficit is ballooning at a rate faster than ever.
No question.
Suddenly no one has any issues with the deficit. So I do find that quite interesting.
I tell you, the Republicans are pretty impressive with the way they choose to manage and to challenge these kinds of things. So it's kind of interesting to watch.
They've been brilliant tacticians, and you have to give that to them.
You have to give them credit.
You have to give them credit because in almost every way they have outmaneuvered the Democrats.
No question.
Whether it comes to using census data and technology and machine learning to redraw districts, which gives them control now. You really have to look at them and give them credit where credit's due, because they've been able to block everything that the Democrats have tried to do in the past, And now we'll have to see what the Democrats can do that they've taken control of the House.
Unfortunately, I don't have a whole lot of faith in the Democrats because they consistently fall short of the masterminds on the Republican side. That's just my opinion.
I agree. I agree.
Yeah.
And, you do have to give them credit. The Democrats always fall short, and the Democrats did a lot to shoot themselves in the foot during the presidential election. A lot of people lost faith in the DNC after it came out that the DNC was colluding against Bernie Sanders.
Yes.
I know that separated a large portion of the younger millennial voting bloc who felt like, if you're going to do this to a candidate I believe in, if you're not going to give him a fair chance to be a candidate, why should I vote for Hillary? You think I'm just going to fall in line? Well, I'm not. And now we have Donald Trump as president.
Yep. That's an interesting perspective, especially related to millennials. Okay, I'm going to move on to a topic that is completely different than what we've just finished talking about. And it starts out with a simple question. Is President Trump compromised?
I like this question because it can be approached in a few ways. So let's talk about the word compromised, because there's different levels of severity when it comes to that. Looking at the facts, it's true that in the past, Trump, after multiple failed businesses and bankruptcies, had trouble finding funding for his ventures. And it's known that Russia, people in Russia, banks in Russia, were the only ones willing to loan him money. Now, does owing someone money, substantial amounts of money, make you compromised by them?
I think so.
I would think so.
I think so.
I would think so. And there's a reason why our founding fathers stressed that presidents shouldn't be getting money or owing money to foreign agents.
Yes.
And it's because as soon as you owe someone something, then your entire integrity, every decision you make comes into question, whether or not it's true, right? Whether or not you are actually acting on behalf of someone who you owe money to, it always creates the question, and that doubt is just as bad as it being accurate. So I think that he is compromised. I think you look at the tax returns and the fact that they were never shown. There's just so many questions about the past. He said he had no dealings with Russia. He said it multiple times with his hands up in normal Trump fashion. No dealings with Russia. But now we know that they were actively working on Trump Tower Moscow. Absolutely. And that Putin was promised the penthouse there.
Absolutely.
And that he was planning on renting out a lot of rooms so that people who rented would have access to Putin. So time and time again, things that he says have proven to be lies.
Yes.
And that does not give me confidence that he's not compromised. Yes. I'll tell you that.
That's interesting, though, because it raises a question, right, of what does it mean for the President of the United States to be compromised? The reason I say that is because when you think about it, it becomes a question of, well, what is the president willing to do to get himself out of his personal predicament? What is he willing to do in terms of our country and our entire citizenry? So what does it mean that he's compromised, and what could be the outcome, if you will, of the President of the United States being compromised?
We're definitely in uncharted territory. I don't know about in your lifetime, but I've never experienced anything like this, where there's been this level of doubt or a shroud of secrecy around the president or their financial dealings or their meetings with other leaders. So the meetings with Putin that happened one-on-one with Trump, where he would confiscate the interpreter's notes.
Right.
Things like this don't point towards someone who's not guilty.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you. It's quite honestly, for me, this is a very scary time.
Right.
It's very scary because I see our President of the United States of America in the presence of Vladimir Putin seemingly vulnerable and weak. I mean, here's a man who towers over Putin. but his demeanor suggests he's fearful of Putin. It's kind of sad to watch, actually.
It's interesting, and not just with Putin. You know, the way that Trump acts with our allies, whether it's Angela Merkel, any of our allies, compared to the way he acts with dictators around the world, there's stark differences.
Yes.
And I think that says a lot about how Trump sees himself on the national stage and what kind of leader he views himself as.
I agree with that. It's not just dictators. He seems to just kind of placate to people who are just bad people. Like
right.
Like
Kim Jong-un.
Yeah, and the sheriff, what's the sheriff in Arizona?
Joe Arpaio.
Arpaio, yeah. I've seen Pompeo in Arizona, the way he treated those people who were incarcerated, leaving them out in the sun and that kind of stuff, and all these things he did. Donald Trump seems to like these kinds of people. I don't know why that is, but it's interesting to watch him do that. But I tell you, this notion that he seems to me to be so vulnerable, and I think some of his actions, you touched on this earlier, with Angela Merkel and some of our other leaders around the country in France and Europe and so on. He's willing to tear down. He's willing to tear down those relationships,
right,
for the purpose of enhancing his relationship with Putin, which to me again is another suggestion that he's compromised and trying to do what seems to please Putin.
Absolutely. If you took out a piece of paper and drew 2 columns, and in one column you wrote the things that we've done that Russia approves of, and in the other column you wrote
yes.
the things that we've done that our traditional allies approved of,
right,
it becomes really clear. I mean, the list is long.
Yes.
It's, from Russia's perspective, its biggest threat is NATO. And Trump has always been trying to dismantle it.
Trying to tear it down.
Trying
Yes.
to see discontent within
Absolutely.
NATO. And if you look at the actions, it becomes clear.
Yes.
Whether it's sanctions
Yes.
that should have been applied but
Right.
haven't been.
Yeah, and then they lift them or weaken them
Right.
so that they're less effective, so that Putin can continue to go on with his business.
Absolutely. And the other oligarchs in Russia can continue to make money, despite the fact that our intelligence community says that they meddled in our election.
Yes. This is a scary time for me. It's scary because and I'll have to go back to the conversation we had earlier and conversation in this podcast about the fact that we have a Republican Congress unwilling to check our president.
Right.
And it becomes a question of how far are they willing to let him go. And that scares me.
Absolutely.
It scares me for a lot of reasons, not just because of Putin, but because of other laws that are in place. And some of the things he's doing at the border, it's a question of, wow, what is Congress willing to let them do? What is our United States Senate willing to let him do?
Right, where is the line?
Yes. And for me, I've thought about this a lot. It's a question of, wow, he's had several meetings that we know about with Putin that were undocumented. Now, people knew about the meetings, but it recently came out that there's a belief that he has had at least close to 100 phone calls with Putin that most of America does not know about. And I just heard that on the news. I think I may have read it somewhere as well. So it becomes a question of, wow, what the hell is going on behind the scenes with our president and Putin?
Right.
And it raises that question of, what does this notion of being compromised, what does it mean? What is Trump willing to do to get out of this mess that he's created for himself?
Right. And unfortunately, we've had to play this game where it's wait for the Mueller report to come out, and
Yes.
then we all have to hope that something gets done about it. And on the flip side, I think the left needs to be prepared for the report potentially not confirming what their fears are. So that needs to be kept in mind as well. The
Absolutely.
results of the report need to be honored, even if it doesn't go along with the left's beliefs. And I would say the same
totally
towards
agree
the
with
right. And
Yes.
I think it would be an interesting situation if the report came out and said there was no collusion.
Yes, I totally agree with that, because at the end of the day, no one knows what's in that report. So there could be nothing, or it could be on the other end of the spectrum,
Right.
where we may figure out that, hey, listen, Putin has like 45% of our nuclear codes. Because we really don't know.
We really don't
Because
know.
it comes back to that question of, what does it mean for the president of the United States of America to be compromised? And I think, I'm not sure about the nuclear codes, and I'm not exactly sure how it works, but my guess is that those codes are broken into segments, and not a single person has at any point the entire code,
Right.
because they may just lose their minds and go do something that would be crazy or something like that. But it does become a question of, wow, what does it mean? And what is Trump willing to do? And how much is our Congress willing to allow him to do?
Right. And unfortunately, the answer seems to be still, we have to wait and see how it plays out.
Absolutely. So this has been a great conversation. And Cody, I know you're busy, and I've been very busy as well, but I would love it if you would come back and do some more of these podcasts with me. I've gotten some feedback, and I want to have a broader discussion about a number of different things. And this was a good starting place to break away from the previous podcast that we've had. So thank you so much for coming and being a part of this. And I know we have a few things that we're going to be working on today, but I appreciate you being here and helping me out with this.
Yeah, I had a great time, Ralph. Look forward to being back, and maybe we'll have some new updates on this subject to talk about next time I'm here.
Absolutely.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on Be the Change. Be sure to subscribe today, and don't forget to rate and review so we can continue to bring you the best conversations. Visit ralphharper.com for show notes, resources, and events. To support Be the Change, please join our patron community at patreon.com/Ralph Harper. Be the Change returns the same time next week and is brought to you by the 2060s Project.